The local Muslims were without doubt outgunned and outmanned in the days of the 17th of April and thereafter. Following their surrender, they became protected persons, subject to the protection of Geneva Conventions 3 and 4. The commanders of the occupying forces were obliged to follow the duties imposed by these conventions for the treatment of civilians and prisoners of war. Had these conventions been upheld, Mladen Naletilic would not be before this tribunal today. The 75 to 80 men who surrendered their arms to the HVO that day were not all combatants. They were interrogated by Ivan Andabak, among others, held overnight in unpleasant conditions, and transported the next day to Lubushki prison. The Muslim houses of Sovici and Doljani were for the most part torched and remain uninhabitable to this day. All the civilians of Sovici were held against their will in either the school building or crowded into a small hamlet under armed guard for almost 3 weeks, when they were effectively expelled to ABIH-held territory. Mladen Naletilic is guilty of their unlawful transfer. Many of the soldiers who surrendered to the HVO in the village of Sovici testified to harrowing mistreatment on the bus on the way to and while in Lubushki prison. Witness Y was specifically selected for especially cruel treatment. His tormentors were frequently members of the Convicts Battalion, who it was reported were beyond the control of either the prison commander or the local police. This same torture and mistreatment became the pattern in the Heliodrome and Cherokee Brig. The same specific members of the Convicts Battalion were identified on numerous occasions. They belonged either to the KB unit in Cherokee Brig or to the Mermak Vinko Skrobo unit. They acted with apparent impunity under the command of Mladen Naletilic. Mladen Naletilic must take responsibility for the actions of his subordinates, as he observed their treatment of prisoners at Sovici and Doljani and on the bus taking prisoners to Lubushki, and he did nothing to prevent further ill treatment or to punish his soldiers' behavior. Some of the ABIH soldiers who refused to surrender and who may have continued to resist the HVO attack were captured a few days later. They were taken to the HVO headquarters in Doljani to Naletilic, who was described to them only as Tuta. There they were beaten, tortured, and abused in the presence of and with the participation of Mladen Naletilic. It is a great pity that a man much respected and revered by his soldiers acted as he did. He could with ease have been an example to his troops. Instead, his abuse of captured combatants, his tolerance of the appalling mistreatment of the local ABIH commander by his soldiers, the ordering of the destruction of Muslim houses and mosque in Doljani, the forced transfer of all Muslims out of the area, all set the pattern for future abuse of Muslim prisoners by the soldiers of his Convicts Battalion. Many of the men from the village who became prisoners in Lubushki were subsequently moved to the Heliodrome and forced to work on the confrontation line in Mostar. One family in Sovici lost 3 sons in Mostar. The next scene of inquiry and findings is Mostar. The simmering tensions between the HVO and the ABIH bubbled over on the 9th of May 1993 when a well-organized mass roundup of Muslims to the Heliodrome was carried out. At the same time, there was a massive attack and bombardment of the ABIH headquarters. The roundup involved the civilian population of Mostar. Their only common denominator was their Muslim identity. Young and old, influential or insignificant, they were herded out of their homes in the early morning and directed at gunpoint to collection centers and then to the Heliodrome, when no reason for their transfer and detention was given, apart from that it was for their protection. It was not deemed necessary to lock up Croat citizens of Mostar. That should be BH Croat, citizens of Mostar. The Red Cross and other humanitarian organizations were denied access to the heliodrome until the international community became involved and effected the release of the women, children and elderly men. Assurances to release the other detainees were not heeded. Many of the other Muslim civilians were forced to cross the Naletilic to the east side of the city. The ABIH soldiers in their headquarters and the civilian residents of the same high-rise building complex remained under siege until they surrendered the following day. Soldiers were then separated from the group and brought by Juka, commander of a KB unit, to Mladen Naletilić and many other HVO luminaries. The soldiers were physically and psychologically abused by Naletilić in the presence of his soldiers, thereby repeating the pattern set in Sovici and Doljani. These soldiers were then directed by Naletilić personally to the MUP station in Široki Brijeg, his hometown and the seat of the KB headquarters, where they were held under inhumane conditions and frequently and severely abused. Some of the prominent civilian leaders who emerged from the besieged Vranica building were tortured and mistreated and held in captivity until the end of the conflict. Mladen Naletilić was responsible personally for the torture of Zed. Witness FF, one of the ABIH soldiers who surrendered, was the son of a prominent politician. He was personally tortured by Naletilić, who following interrogation informed him that his father had been executed that morning. The prisoner lost the use of his arm when injured while obliged to repair fortifications on the front line, and he believed that his father was dead right up to the date of his release in March 1994. The soldiers who surrendered in Mostar were held at the MUP station in Široki Brijeg and were subjected to violent assaults by members of the Convicts Battalion. Some named prisoners were selected for interrogation and torture. The chamber finds Mladen Naletilić responsible as commander for this torture. There is no reason to suppose that Mladen Naletilić, who had personally directed the detention of these prisoners to Široki Brijeg following a threat to have them executed, was unaware of the conditions of their detention and their treatment. Similarly, when prisoners of war were subjected to cruel treatment at both the MUP station and the cells in his headquarters at Široki Brijeg tobacco station, he must bear command responsibility for this prohibited treatment. After some time, the prisoners in Široki Brijeg were taken out to work on the municipal pool. This pool has been wrongly described as Tutas pool. Some skilled prisoners of war worked for specified members of the Convicts Battalion. The testimony of these prisoners established that their skills were instrumental in preventing further abuse at the hands of those notorious Convicts Battalion members who assaulted prisoners in their cells and who now had become their masters. The chamber heard testimony of harsh work conditions undertaken by prisoners for a period of 2 months during high summer on a canal leading to the Naletilić villa. Defense evidence suggests that this canal was for the installation of radio cables to a hill near the villa and not for Naletilić's personal benefit. Such labor is not prohibited, but the harsh conditions are. Naletilić visited the worksite and was aware therefore of the conditions and must bear command responsibility for the unlawful labor. He is acquitted of the charges relating to inhuman treatment, inhumane acts, and cruel treatment, as the extreme discomfort of the prisoners did not reach the requisite standard for such findings. The Convicts Battalion had a number of subunits. Some were what has been described as intervention units, who were temporarily attached to other commands for a specific purpose. For the most part, these intervention units had the appearance of a more elite corps being led by professionally trained soldiers. There were also a number of so-called ATGs, or anti-terrorist units, whose role seemed to be to hold the confrontation line in Mostar. These units were of a paramilitary nature. Their members rarely had any professional training, although most of them had completed mandatory service with the JNA before the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. These units had no role in traveling to trouble spots and remained in Mostar. Vinko Martinović was the commander of one of these ATGs, which was made up of his old comrades from the HOS. His unit started out as the Mermak unit and then became the Vinko Skrobo ATG. His base was in the former medical center, which had been damaged in the Serb conflict, and may already have been his HOS base at that time. Certainly on the 9th of May, he and his followers were already in place there and taking their meals at their usual canteen. There is some evidence that the unit had been resurrected before the 9th of May and was engaged in action as such unit that day, but no finding is made on this point. After some weeks, Vinko Martinović took his orders from the Mostar town defense and from the Supreme Command of the KB. How the unit first came to be associated with the Convicts Battalion and Mladen Naletilić is not clear. The Chamber has received convincing corroborated evidence that the Vinko Skrobo unit was part of the Convicts Battalion. The most telling of this evidence was a statement made to a court in Zagreb by Martinović himself in the presence of Naletilić when he was called as a defense witness in proceedings unrelated to this trial. The Chamber received the testimony of Jan van Hecke, a senior investigator from the Office of the Prosecutor, who was present in the Zagreb court when this testimony was given. Martinović stated then that he was the commander of the Vinko Skrobo unit, which formed part of the Convicts Battalion under the command of Mladen Naletilić. This testimony further corroborates the testimony of former Convicts Battalion members and the documents seized at the tobacco factory in Široki Brijeg. Vinko Martinovic's main task was to hold the front line against the ABIH, who were literally shouting distance away. In holding this line, he used many Muslim prisoners from the Heliodrome to carry out work digging and repairing trenches and sandbag fortifications, carrying supplies, and generally assisting the soldiers of his unit. The prisoners had a tough existence, with harsh living conditions in the Heliodrome and dangerous work conditions at the front line. Although the HVO used printed forms reminding commanders that the use of prisoners of war for labor was subject to the Geneva Conventions, there was no evidence that these conventions were applied in the Vinko Skrobo unit, or area of responsibility. Prisoners were forced to work in crossfire without the minimum protection of a flak jacket or helmet, and many suffered death and injury. An attitude of complete indifference to the welfare of prisoners prevailed. Their fate depended on Vinko Martinovic's humor each day. There were prisoners who, as friends prior to the war, enjoyed his protection and who were required only to work in the relative safety of his headquarters at Kalimova Street and render free their technical and mechanical skills. Those fortunate ones were not exposed to the dangers of the front line, which were in general reserved to former combatants. Many of these testified that they felt safer at Stelas than anywhere else. They were indeed the lucky ones. There were many who were less fortunate. Among the worst excesses committed by Vinko Martinović against these prisoners was their use as human shields on the 17th of September 1993. On that day, 4 prisoners of war were dressed in HVO uniforms and furnished with replica Kalashnikov guns. One of the selected prisoners was so frightened of what was to happen that he fainted and was replaced by another prisoner. The 4 prisoners in uniform were ordered to walk alongside a tank to draw fire from the other side. The opposing army was aware of the misuse of prisoners in this way and frequently held their fire, hence the wearing of the HVO uniforms on this occasion. In the confusion caused by the firing of the tank into the buildings opposite and the deafening noise of gunfire, the 4 prisoners armed with replica wooden rifles made it to the other side and relative safety. At least 3 of them were injured. While the word human shield is used in the indictment, decoy would be the most appropriate description for the position in which the prisoners were put to draw fire and protect the HVO advance. Vinko Martinović is personally responsible for the inhuman treatment, inhumane acts, and cruel treatment to the 4 prisoners in this incident. The chamber received a wooden rifle into evidence. This rifle may well be the rifle carried by witness PP that day and subsequently taken by an ABIH soldier in the building on the opposite side. This soldier kept the rifle until 2002, when he gave it to an investigator from the OTP. He described receiving it from a prisoner dressed as a soldier in HVO uniform. His description of the prisoner fits PP's description. PP was shown this rifle and recognized it by a hole which he said had housed a screw holding the rifle strap and which had worked loose. Forensic examination of the rifle could not determine when the rifle was made, but screw holes were noted. The chamber does not require an identification of the rifles to establish that the event took place. 3 prisoners of war signed out to the Vinko Skrobo units lost their lives that day. Others were injured while obliged to collect the injured and fallen HVO soldiers. The indictment charges Vinko Martinović with the willful killing of the 3 prisoners who were killed on the confrontation line that day. These prisoners were clearly signed out to Vinko Martinović personally and were engaged on the front line in prohibited labor. This evidence cannot, however, rebut the suggestion made by the Martinović defense that the 3 prisoners may have died in an escape attempt during the confusion created by the firing of the tank. As all 4 of the prisoners with the replica rifles made it to the other side, there is the possibility that the 3 prisoners, Chulaković Aziz, Chulaković Hamjia, and Pajo Enes, tried to make a run and were caught in crossfire. Vinko Martinović must receive the benefit of that doubt. The loss of prisoners' lives at Santićeva Street that day was enormous. Santićeva Street was outside of Vinko Skrobo operations. Vinko Martinović cannot be held responsible. He is, however, responsible for the unlawful labor of the prisoners on the front line, as ordering the unlawful labor, and as a commander for the acts of his subordinates. There was no convincing evidence to relate the deaths of prisoners at Santićeva Street as human shields to the Convicts Battalion or Naletilić. He must be acquitted. Several terrifying misuse of prisoners of war occurred in Rashčani village, a village to the west of Mostar, which changed hands frequently during the conflict. On the 23rd of September, while the Convicts Battalion was engaged in combat operations there, several prisoners were forced to walk 5 or 6 meters in front of the Convicts Battalion soldiers and to search houses where it was believed that ABIH soldiers were hiding. This search was carried out in the very real fear of the presence of Armia troops, as bodies of soldiers of both armies were found in the vicinity, and 2 ABIH soldiers were captured. This incident is the subject of charges of cruel treatment, inhuman acts, and inhumane treatment against Mladen Naletilić. Although Naletilić was the commander of his troops on that occasion, the evidence is that he was not actually in the village at the time, as he was directing operations from a higher location and may have been unaware of the use to which the prisoners were put. He is therefore entitled to the benefit of the doubt on these charges and on the charges of what was clearly also unlawful labor. When the 2 ABIH soldiers were captured, they were immediately physically abused by soldiers of the Convicts Battalion, whose members on this occasion included BH Croat convicted criminals recently released from the Heliodrome. One of these criminals was about to set fire to the captives when a radio message from Stari ordered that they be brought alive to Široki Brijeg. Chamber understands that Stari is Mladen Naletilić. These soldiers did not fare well at the tobacco factory headquarters of the KB. They were kept in solitary confinement in inhuman conditions and beaten on a regular basis. This treatment is the subject of torture charges found against Mladen Naletilić. Returning to the events of September 17, 1993, HVO and SIS documents show that Mladen Naletilić, with two other highly placed members of the HVO military, was one of the planners of this attempt to take territory and move the front line. They acted without the knowledge and approval of the HVO main staff, an indicator of the power and influence Mladen Naletilić exercised as commander of the Convicts Battalion. There is no evidence that he was aware of the wooden rifles incident. Vinko Martinović solely bears responsibility for this grave breach of the Geneva Conventions in relation to prisoners of war, and Mladen Naletilić is acquitted of this series of charges. Steller's activities during the war were not confined to the front line. He and his now infamous subordinates and others were involved in evicting Muslims from their flats and forcing them to leave the west side of Mostar. They were also engaged in the looting of those now emptied flats. The prohibited activity described as unlawful transfer is an almost inadequate depiction of the crime with all its attendant horrors. The very quietly understated text accompanying a video film made by BBC war correspondent Jeremy Bowen, shown to the trial chamber, captured some of the true horrors of unlawful transfers. Civilians in time of war usually suffer depredation of some sort. To minimize the suffering of non-combatants in a conflict, Geneva Convention 4 guarantees civilians they cannot be moved unless for their own safety. Any such prohibited transfer or deportation is deemed a grave breach of this convention. The elderly and young civilians of Mostar were therefore entitled to expect to remain in their homes without HVO or KB soldiers arriving at their door and forcing them out. In Mostar, the Geneva Convention was not heeded. The civilians targeted were moved to the east side without their consent or sanction, without their clothes or necessities, and with guns firing over their heads. The chamber heard very convincing and distressing evidence of the involvement of Vinko Martinović personally and that of his soldiers in this activity. His unit was the subject of frequent and adverse comment in CIS reports and that of humanitarian organizations. The ABIH commander Arif Pasalic wrote to the ECMM observers complaining of this behavior and naming Mladen Naletilić, Ivan Andabak and Vinko Martinović for the eviction of many Muslim citizens from their homes at gunpoint and the forcing of these people over the remnants of the old Mostar footbridge to the east side of the city. The chamber heard and received convincing documentary and oral evidence connecting the Convicts Battalion with the wave of evictions which occurred on the 29th of September 1993. Vinko Martinović is guilty of such unlawful transfers and looting for his personal involvement and for the activities of his subordinates. Mladen Naletilić is guilty as a commander, who, being aware of the wave of evictions or ethnic cleansing on the 29th of September and the involvement of his subordinates, including Ivan Andabak, did nothing to punish the actions or to prevent their occurrence. Nenad Harmandić, a former police inspector, was one of Steller's victims. He was specifically sought out on the 13th of July 1993 at the Heliodrome, where he was a prisoner. He was beaten and taunted throughout the day while at the Vinko Skrobo headquarters. When the other prisoners were leaving to return to the Heliodrome, he was left behind. The other prisoners were admonished to forget what they had seen or heard. The prison authorities were told he had escaped. His body was exhumed 5 years later, where it was revealed that he had suffered multiple fractures and a bullet wound to his head. His injuries were such that he could not walk prior to being shot. The chamber heard the evidence of Halil Ajanic, an acquaintance of Vinko Martinović for many years and a civilian prisoner at the Heliodrome. He testified to the beating and abuse of Nenad Hamandić at the Vinko Skrobo base. In spite of the efforts to discredit this simple and brave man, who gave his testimony in open court with no protective measures, the chamber is convinced by the truth of his testimony. The identification of the remains of those of the late Nenad Hamandić was contested, and an expert called to cast doubt on the identification conclusions. The chamber accepts that there is a question over the height of Nenad Hamandić when alive and the estimated height of the remains. The chamber has considered this discrepancy against the other findings at autopsy. These findings included identification by a close relative of his belt buckle, shoe, teeth, cigarette lighter, and most important, the discovery of a bullet embedded in muscle tissue in his right thigh. The close relative was aware that several years earlier, Nenad Hamandić had accidentally shot himself in the right thigh and the bullet had never been removed. The exhumation team of forensic pathologists was specifically directed to this fact before the autopsy took place. The possibility that another body, unrelated to Nenad Hamandić, could also have a bullet of the same caliber in the right thigh negates any discrepancy in the post-mortem height found. No allowance was made when hearing the testimony of the two forensic experts for the possibility of human error in the measurement of the femur or indeed the estimated height of Nenad Hamandić while living. The chamber therefore finds that the findings at autopsy, combined with the location of the burial site by the witness who buried the body, determinative. The other evidence of false representations to the Heliodrome authorities that he had escaped, coupled with conversations with the Hamandić family that he had been killed at the Vinko Skrobo unit, convinced the trial chamber of the involvement of Vinko Martinović in his killing. The secret burial and the injuries to the body, which are inconsistent with any possibility of flight, are all links in a chain of strong circumstantial evidence which convinced the chamber that Vinko Martinović played a role in Nenad Hamandić's death. He is guilty of cruel treatment and willfully causing great suffering to Nenad Hamandić. His participation before and after the shooting amounts to substantial involvement in his killing in the form of encouragement and practical assistance. He is guilty of individual criminal responsibility of aiding and abetting the murder of Nenad Hamandić. Mladen Naletilić was charged with the destruction of Muslim houses in Sovici, Doljani and Rashtani. There was evidence that the houses in Rashtani were substantially damaged in previous skirmishes. Mladen Naletilić must be acquitted on this charge. There is compelling evidence that Mladen Naletilić ordered the destruction of the Muslim houses in Doljani. This order was carried out to good effect. No charge is brought in relation to the mosque in Doljani. There is insufficient evidence as to the involvement of the Convicts Battalion in the burning of Muslim houses in Sovici, and the same situation prevails with the mosque in Sovici. Mladen Naletilić is therefore not guilty of the charges relating to Muslim property in Sovici. He is guilty of ordering the destruction of Muslim houses in Doljani. The prosecution case is that all the unlawful treatment of civilians and prisoners was motivated by a discriminatory intent towards this section of the population who were specifically targeted because they were Muslims. The main judgment deals with the legal issues associated with a finding that such persecution existed. It suffices at this stage to say that the chamber is satisfied from the weight of the evidence that the Muslim civilian population of Mostar, Sovici and Doljani were subject to persecution. Neither Mladen Naletilić nor Vinko Martinović were the grand architects of this plan and its implementation. They each, however, played a role in giving effect to the plan. The Chamber is satisfied that the detention and subsequent transfer of the civilian population of Doljani and Sovici was motivated by malice towards Muslims, and that they were the object of discrimination. Mladen Naletilić is guilty of persecution of the civilian population of Sovici and Doljani. He is also found guilty of the torture of two civilians referred to previously as Z and FF. These two witnesses were members of or associated with the SDA leadership in Herzegovina and were targeted because they were Muslims associated with certain political beliefs. Vinko Martinović protested vehemently through his council that he never discriminated against Muslims, having many Muslims in his unit and under his protection. The Chamber nevertheless finds that the crimes already proved involving the rounding up and movement of Muslims on the 9th of May, the 13th of June and the 29th of September were committed with discriminatory intent. The Muslim civilians of Mostar were targeted for no reason than their Muslim ethnicity. Vinko Martinović was personally involved on those occasions and therefore bears responsibility under Article 7.1. Mladen Naletilić bears responsibility under Article 7.3 for the unlawful transfer carried out by his subordinates on the 13th of June and the 29th of September 1993. There are no further charges against the accused after the end of September 1993. It is not the function of this chamber to deal further with the events in Herzegovina. It is clear, however, that the suffering of the prisoners and civilians continued for a very considerable time thereafter. Prisoners and soldiers continued to die on both sides of the conflict, and the beautiful old starry moss was destroyed to the loss of all the peoples of Mostar. As previously mentioned, no group was immune from the terrible suffering. What we know is that following a ceasefire agreement, the war officially ended. Time will tell if the scars will heal and the wonderful fabric of the diverse city described by the leader of the Jewish community in Mostar will return. Mladen Naletilić and Vinko Skrobo are responsible for much of the pain inflicted and must now take the consequences of their actions.
Yes. For the foregoing reasons, and having applied applicable standards in relation to the cumulative convictions, the Chamber entered the following convictions. Mr. Mladen Naletilić, please stand up. The Chamber finds you guilty on the following counts. Count 1. Persecution on political, racial, and religious grounds as a crime against humanity under Article 5H of the Statute. Count 5. Unlawful labor as a violation of laws and customs of war under Article 3 of the Statute. Count 9. Torture as a crime against humanity under Article 5F of the Statute. Count 10. Torture as a grave breach of the Geneva Convention of 1949 under Article 2B of the Statute. Count 12. Willful causing great sufferings or serious injury to body or health as a grave breach of the Geneva Convention of 1949 under Article 2C of the Statute. Count 18, unlawful transfer of a civilian and a grave breach of Geneva Convention of 1949 and Article 2G of the Statute. Count 20, wanton destruction not justified by military necessity as a violation of the laws and customs of war and Article 3B of the Statute. Count 21, plunder of public or private property as a violation of the laws or customs of war under Article 3E of the Statute. The Chamber acquits you on the following counts. Count 2, inhumane acts as a crime against humanity, under Article 5I of the statute. Count 3, inhuman treatment as a grave breach of the Geneva Convention of 1949, under Article 2B of the statute. Count 4, cruel treatment as a violation of the laws and customs of war, under Article 3 of the statute. Count 6, murder as a crime against humanity, under Article 5A of the statute. Count 7, unwillful killing as a grave breach of Geneva Conventions of 1949, under Article 2A of the statute. Count 8, murder as a violation of laws and customs of war, under Article 3 of the statute. Count 11, cruel treatment as a violation of laws and customs of war, under Article 3 of the statute. Count 19, extensive destruction of properties as a grave breach of Geneva Convention of 1949, under Article 2D of the statute. Count 22, seizure, destruction, or willful damage done to institutions dedicated to religion as a violation of laws and customs of war, under Article 3D of the statute. In determining the appropriate sentence to be imposed on you, the Chamber has adhered to all the formal requirements laid down in the statute and the rules, and to its obligation to fit sentence to the gravity of the crimes and the individual circumstances of the accused. As an aggravating circumstance, the Chamber took into account your status as a commander and your position of great influence in that area. The Chamber further found that defense has not presented evidence as to your medical condition, such as to constitute a mitigating circumstance. Furthermore, the Chamber found no mitigating circumstances, as your transfer from the Republic of Croatia to the tribunal was not voluntary, and as you have not shown substantial cooperation with the prosecutor. Taking all these circumstances into account, the Chamber hereby sentences you, Mr. Mladen Naletilić, to a single sentence of 20 years of imprisonment. Pursuant to Rule 101C of the rules, you are entitled to credit for time spent in detention as of the date of this judgment, together with such additional time that you may serve pending the determination of any appeal. Pursuant to Rule 103C of the rules, you shall remain in the custody of the tribunal pending finalization of arrangements for your transfer to the state while you shall serve your sentence. You may sit down, please. Mr. Vinko Martinović, the Chamber finds you guilty on the following counts. Count 1, persecution on political, racial, and religious grounds as a crime against humanity, under Article 5H of the statute. Count 2, inhumane acts as a crime against humanity, under Article 5I of the statute. Count 3, inhuman treatment as a grave breach of the Geneva Convention of 1949, under Article 2B of the statute. Count 5, unlawful labor as a violation of laws and customs of war, under Article 3 of the statute. Count 12, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health as grave breach of Geneva Convention of 1949, under Article 2C of the statute. Count 13, murder as a crime against humanity, under Article 5A of the statute. Count 14, willful killing as a grave breach of the Geneva Convention of 1949, under Article 2A of the statute. Count 18, unlawful transfer of civilian as a grave breach of Geneva Conventions of 1949 and Article 2G of the Statute. Count 21, plunder of public or private property as a violation of laws or customs of war and Article 3E of the Statute. Vinko Martinović, you are acquitted on the following counts. Count 4, cruel treatment as a violation of laws and customs of war under Article 3 of the Statute. Count 6, murder as a crime against humanity under Article 5A of the Statute. Count 7, willful killing as a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions of 1949 under Article 2A of the Statute. Count 8, murder as a violation of laws or customs of war under Article 3 of the Statute. Count 11, cruel treatment as a violation of laws and customs of war under Article 3 of the Statute. Count 15, murder as a violation of laws or customs of war under Article 3 of the Statute. Count 16, cruel treatment as a violation of the laws or customs of war under Article 3 of the Statute. Count 17, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health as a grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions of 1949 under Article 2C of the Statute. In determining the appropriate sentence to be imposed on you, the Chamber has also adhered to all the formal requirements laid down in the statute and the rules, and to its obligation to fit the sentence to the gravity of the crime and the individual circumstances of the accused. As a primary consideration, the Chamber noted that you have been found guilty of heinous crimes, including murder. The Chamber further considered your commander's role and influence on your unit as an aggravating circumstance. Further, your transfer to the tribunal has not been deemed voluntary, so as to constitute a mitigating circumstance. Considering your prior criminal conduct, the Chamber noted that the conviction of murder rendered by Zagreb County Court is pending appeal and has not taken it into account as an aggravating circumstance. It also has not considered your previous convictions for grand larceny and looting in light of the nature of the crimes that you are found guilty of today. Taking all those circumstances into the account, the Chamber hereby sentences you, Vinko Martinović, to a single sentence of 18 years imprisonment. Pursuant to Rule 101C of the rules, you are entitled to credit for time spent in the detention as of the date of this judgment. Together with such additional time you may serve pending the determination of any appeal. Pursuant to the Rule 103C of the rules, you shall remain in custody of the tribunal pending finalization of any arrangements for your transfer to the state while you shall serve your sentence. You may sit down, please. The hearing is adjourned.
All rise for your